Nope.
もう遅い。脱出不可能や。8秒経過。ぶっ潰れよ。
Anky is a bad animal. The odds are that you've heard this phrase before if you keep even a little bit of a close eye on the Isles community, whether it be in the Discord, on a stream, or in the Isle itself. The term Anky is a bad animal has been thrown around as a joke in the Isle community, or at least as what began as one. Isle developer Brian Phillips, the current animator for the Isle, originally coined the phrase to express his dislike for the Ankylosaurus, albeit in a slightly comedic manner. I emphasize the word slightly, by the way. At first, not much was thought of it, other than people wondering why the Anky, of all things, was the dinosaur that Brian disliked. It was really nothing major, just kind of a silly thought. But as time went on, the joke seemingly became more and more unironic, even going as far as to have other developers saying the same thing. And there's a point where you have to start to wonder, is this even a joke anymore? Or do people genuinely think that an animal that has so much potential to have a unique gameplay style is a worse pick than some of the other already confirmed playable dinosaurs? Well, the simple answer is, this has transcended beyond a joke. Far beyond, in fact. In one of Brian Phillips' more recent streams, he went into extreme detail saying why the Anky is such a poor choice to add to the survival roster, which we will take a look at later. And on the surface, his arguments do seem to hold some legitimacy, and yet if you dig just a little deeper, the reasons he mentions can actually be spun in favor of not only Anky becoming a playable dinosaur, but can even pave the way for the best version of Anky possible. Anky is not a bad animal. So, before we start things off, we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is a bad animal? Most people can agree that the correct definition of what makes a dinosaur a bad animal is something along the lines of this. If any given animal cannot either fight back against what can kill it, or run from what can kill it without it being conceptually ridiculous, then it is not viable, and in turn is a bad animal. Calling something a bad animal is essentially the Owl community's way of saying that a dinosaur is not viable under any circumstances, meaning that it is fundamentally flawed as a playable with no way to justify its existence in the game. Now, allow me to clarify before someone tries to call me out on my use of the word viable. The definition of viability is the capability of something working successfully. So, take Ceratosaurus for instance. Something like Ceratosaurus is not viable. The idea behind Ceratosaurus in the Isle is that it's a mid-tier underdog carnivore that hunts small game and can either escape from or violently defend itself against larger carnivores. Now, as you know, this is not the case because Cerato gets trashed by practically every other dinosaur in survival due to poor balancing. But the concept is there, and said concept makes sense for Cerato, as Cerato does not look stupid outrunning an Allosaurus, nor does it look stupid defending itself against a Carnotaurus. So give Cerato a few stat adjustments and boom, Cerato does exactly what it is supposed to do. Cerato is viable, and in turn is a good animal. Now, let's take a look at a dinosaur that is fundamentally flawed in its initial concept, aka not viable. Enter Ankylosaurus. But Pesky, you can't judge Maggie yet. It isn't even in the game. Trust the devs. Oh, okay. Hang on 1 second and let me explain, and don't become a dev bootlicker on me. Please, that's the last thing we need. Ankylosaurus checks all the boxes on the what makes a bad animal checklist. 1. It cannot fight off what can kill it. And 2. It cannot outrun what can kill it. Now, I hear you asking, so Pesky, why not make its stats good enough so it can do all of those things? Well, that's because, my dear viewer, as stated before, in order for a dinosaur to be viable and not ruin the game for everyone, it needs to not be conceptually ridiculous, or in layman's terms, it needs to not look stupid. Sorry, but no matter what Kissen may say, there is no way that Megarosaurus is going to be able to outrun an Allosaurus without looking incredibly dumb. And the same goes for fighting one. And Megarosaurus isn't exactly the biggest dinosaur in the world either. I mean, hell, its official concept art shows Maggie is likely going to have an even 50-50 matchup against Cerato, who, again, is not supposed to be able to fight off an Allo, at least not alone anyway. If Megarosaurus is going to struggle to fight against a Ceratosaurus, then how in God's name is it supposed to be able to survive an Allo attack? Oh, and forget Carno and Suko. Carno is essentially Cerato except bigger, stronger, and faster in this situation, and Suko would utterly demolish Maggie. Oh, and don't even get me started on the Apex trio. Maggie may as well be Thanos snapped out of existence at that point. All of this leads to the conclusion that Megarosaurus is not viable, meaning that it is, and in my opinion, the epitome of, a bad animal. So, now that we know what a good and a bad animal each consist of, we can use this information to go back and look at our friend Anky. The Isle developers have stated that after the recode, and no, I am not going to call it Everima, that they want dinosaurs to align more closely with their paleontologically accurate size ranges. So, if that's the case, then let's take a look at some more relatively recent paleontological findings. And according to them, Ankylosaurus was not as large as it appeared to be in popular dinosaur media like Walking with Dinosaurs. And it's certainly not a shocker that both the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World renditions are inaccurate as well. In 2004, a re-examination of Ankylosaurus fossils by armored dinosaur expert Kenneth Carpenter took place, showing that a realistic Ankylosaurus was a very short and stubby animal. According to Carpenter's study, Ankylosaurus was 20.5 feet long, 5.6 feet tall at hip height, and 4.9 feet wide, or if you use the metric system, 6.25, 1.7, and 1.5 meters respectively. These are the accurate size measurements that are still used today in regards to Anky. In contrast, currently the Ankylosaurus that we have in the Isle is slightly larger than this, measuring in at about 23 feet, 7 meters long, about 6 feet, 1.8 meters tall at hip height, and about 6.5 feet, 2 meters wide. This means that Ankylosaurus would be receiving a slight downsize from what it is currently. Dondi, the lead developer of the Isle, has also confirmed that Ankylosaurus will in fact be receiving a downsize, albeit in Dondi's classical, "my opinion is always right, and if you disagree I'll angrily state obvious facts in a cruel tone" way. So anyway, now that we know what Anky's new size range will most likely be, we can answer the question. Is Anky a bad animal? Let's listen to what Brian has to say about it.
People have been complaining about the fact that I hate Anky. I don't hate Anky. I think it'd be a bad playable. The reason for that is it's too slow.
Pause. This is an utterly ridiculous argument as to why Anky is bad. Anky is supposed to be slow, as its purpose in the Isle and in real life is to be a literal defensive tank. The point that Anky would be too slow to play as is invalid because of the fact that it's how Anky is meant to be. If Anky were fast, it would be conceptually ridiculous. The only thing Anky needs to do is to be able to tell predators to get lost with its armor and clubbed tail.
So you'd be entirely defensive, and it's too small to defend itself against stuff like T-Rex and Giganotosaurus, and now Spinosaurus as well. So you're basically going to be playing as an animal that can't run away from the things that can kill it, and it can't fight those things and defend itself either.
Now, when many people think of Anky, they think of it shattering the legs of a T-Rex. But to be fair to Brian, this point actually does hold some legitimacy. This is why Anky being downsized to its more realistic proportion is such a game changer in its viability. It's entirely possible that even though T-Rex and Ankylosaurus did live in the same time period, they could still never have met one another due to possibly living in different biomes, giving Anky no feasible reason for it to need to be large enough to defend itself from a T-Rex. Now, it's important to note that I am not saying that T-Rex and Anky would have never ever met 100%, but we have to take the possibility of it into account, as the Isle is a game where dinosaurs that existed millions of years apart are all thrust into competition against one another. And if we are going by accurate size ranges, Anky is quite small compared to the Apex trio, and it could have a tough time fighting them off. So let's just assume that for the sake of argument, if Anky were to meet a Rex, Spino, or Giga in real life, that it would immediately lose to all three of them in a 1v1 confrontation. That's fine, but remember, the Isle is a video game, and a video game is not real life. Several dinosaurs in the Isle have been fictionalized for the purposes of more unique and interesting gameplay. Dilophosaurus is venomous, Troodon is venomous, Bipiosaurus is practically a duck, Hypsilophodon can spit on attackers, Utahraptor looks nothing like a realistic Utahraptor, and even Spinosaurus, one of the animals that Brian says Anky would lose to, is heavily fictionalized, as it takes after the Spinosaurus in Jurassic Park 3. So why not give Anky the same treatment? Make its tail club have enough power to not outright kill an opponent, unless of course the Anky lands a headshot, but enough power to cause severe bone fractures and breaks if an opponent is struck that could lead to the animal either not being able to hunt and die of starvation, or rendering it too weak to defend itself against other enemies. Make its osteoderm strong enough to withstand an attack from a T-Rex with some sort of brand new armor mechanic that reduces damage and is exclusive to Anky. After all, Anky was much too wide for a T-Rex to be able to close its jaws around anyway. And while you're at it, why not give the Anky immunity to bleed damage if it's attacked from above so it can deal with Giga? In that situation, Anky being downsized is actually a good thing, because it's significantly harder for a Giga to reach under Anky's small, stout body to inflict bleed damage without getting whacked in the face by Anky's tail club. You see how this works? But then Brian says this.
It doesn't matter how much Magic Tap does to the design to make it more viable. The things that she would have to do to make it viable, it wouldn't be Anky anymore. So then it's like, why bother?
Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this one. This is perhaps the worst argument against Anky I have ever heard. First off, as exemplified before, tons of dinosaurs in the Isle have been changed in design and or function to fit a certain niche in the Isle. Because Dilo and Troodon are venomous, does that mean that they suddenly aren't Dilo and Troodon anymore? Because Bipiosaurus is a duck, does that suddenly mean that it's not Bipiosaurus anymore? Because Spino, who has the single most inaccurate design of all the Isle's dinosaurs, was saved from the terrible fate of being a quadruped. Does that mean that suddenly it's not Spino anymore? All of the dinosaurs listed have undergone drastic design changes for the purposes of being playable in the Isle. And as I said before, Anky would not require that many design changes at all, other than an armor mechanic and a tail club strong enough to cause life-threatening damage to an opponent.
There's big osteoderm, sure, but that's not going to stop a T-Rex biting its head.
Well, duh. Anky shouldn't be completely unkillable. Plus, with the new turn-in-place mechanic, Anky would likely have a very easy time simply standing still and keeping its tail facing its opponent and its head away from it. If an Anky gets caught off guard by a large predator and gets bit in the head, that's the Anky's fault for not being aware of its surroundings. It essentially works the same way as Stegosaurus, except with more bone-shattering capabilities and less bleeding.
No, Maggie doesn't have the same issue, because Maggie is actually pretty damn large. It's almost as big as an aloe.
What? Unless Maggie is being scaled up, in which case they should have just picked Bajatosaurus and no one would have complained, this argument makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Again, Maggie is more screwed against Apexes than Anky ever will be, and the thought that Maggie will stand a better chance at surviving the Isle than Anky is ludicrous. Remember that Maggie appears to be heavily conceptually flawed.
The problem with Anky is that it does not have the range of motion to defend things with its tail. Period. Its tail's not that flexible. It has about, I think it was 80 degrees of motion.
Okay, now this is just such a cherry pick of an argument that I'm just going to ignore it. Again, exact on-the-nose realism should not be applied to a video game unless your video game is called Saurian, but God knows that game is destined to go nowhere anyway. So, now that we've gone over Anky's problems and solved them, is Anky a bad animal? Well, considering the title of the video, the answer to that is obvious. But when you look at the facts and see how truly easy it is to make Anky a viable dinosaur, then it's quite clear to see why I and many others feel that Anky has so much potential. Anky will probably end up being one of the slowest, if not the slowest dinosaurs in the entirety of the Isle, but that does not matter when the only things that can threaten you are 3 giant apex carnivores. Anky can't outrun anything, but it can defend itself against everything if given the chance, making it a good animal. All Anky has to do is to be able to deter large predators with so much force that it's not worth them risking their life attacking, despite Anky's small size. And if the apex does decide to attack, they better be prepared to go for Anky's head, or else they're gonna come out of the fight bruised, battered, or even fatally crippled. Ankylosaurus has the potential for a very unique playstyle. If done correctly, Anky will work as a docile tank that minds its own business, strolling about eating plants until the carnivore with enough guts attempts to challenge it. Some might call this gameplay style slow or boring, and that's completely fine. Not everyone has to enjoy the same type of gameplay. That's why I play Carnotaurus, because I enjoy the fast-paced, high-speed gameplay that it has to offer. Maybe some people want to play as a peaceful, tanky, slow herbivore that's invulnerable to most threats, and those people should not be denied that. If the Isle is going to be the dinosaur game like the dev team says they want it to be, then they must realize the fact that there has to be a playstyle for everyone. Dismissing a dinosaur by simply calling it a bad animal without a logical, confirmed explanation as to why is extremely small-minded, and it can come across to others that you, as a developer, don't care about the needs of a group of players. I need to stress again that this is in no way a hate video. Developers are entitled to their own opinions about animals in a game just as you and I are, but there does come a point when too much false information without valid reasoning is being spread, and at that point, something has to be said. But alas, I rest my case. Ankylosaurus can easily be turned into the animal that everyone wants it to be, with just a few minor additions to it. No upsize needed, nothing more than an armor mechanic and a tail club that acts as nothing more than a lethal deterrent. Ankylosaurus is not a bad animal. I'm Pesky, and I want to thank you all for watching.